Why is that? Actually, it says right there. Then Pharaoh gave the order to all his people, every boy that is born you must throw in the Nile, but let the girl live. Why is that? Well, they know that if it's a girl and there's no boys to marry, they will marry Egyptian men. And so basically they will eventually intermarry, and then their race will be diluted, and they will basically assimilate to the Egyptians, and they will lose their race. That's why until today, the Jews are especially the Orthodox Jews, are very protective of their race. They do not marry outside their own race. The rabbis make sure that all the Jews marry their own people because they have to preserve their race. Because so many times in the history of mankind, the Jews were trying to be annihilated, right? By Hitler, by so many people. And that's why they try to preserve that race. And this is what's happening here. And so finally, the midwives fear God more than they fear the king. And the midwives let the boys live, and so they kept on growing and prospering. And finally, the Pharaoh gave the command, he sent his troops, kill every boy, throw them into the Nile, but the girl let them live. So Israel finally cried out to God, God, rescue us. And Psalm 50 said this, call upon me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me. God, this is church, this is an encouragement. We need to cry out to God anytime, anywhere, when we're in trouble. God will hear us if we cry from our hearts. And so they cry out to God, and God heard them, and God wants to deliver Israel. But here's interesting though, and this is what I hope you will start catching here. The amazingness how God prepared a situation for the perfect timing. Because God wants to deliver Israel out of Egypt, but look at what Proverbs 30 says. It says, under 3 things the earth quakes, and under 4 it cannot bear up. Okay, there's 4 things, but the first one it says, under a slave when he becomes king. What does it mean that the earth cannot bear when a slave becomes a king? It means that a slave cannot become a king. If you want to have a king, you must have a person that thinks like a king, because a slave will think like a slave. And so if God wants to deliver Israel, he needs to raise a man who does not think like a slave, but he must think like a king. But everybody, all the Jews were slaves. They think like a slave. So God has to prepare a Jew who never experienced slavery that will think like a king. So God had to prepare a Jew, a Hebrew, that never experienced enslavement and that will think like a king. That's what it means. And so guess what happened? All the baby boys were thrown to the Nile, but Moses' mom was so wise that she created a basket and then threw them in the water with the basket from this picture. And then I don't see it here. Do you see it? Oh, okay. Anyway, it must be there somewhere. Okay. That God had to actually, Moses' mom will actually put Moses in the water, and then a princess picks up the baby. Out of all the Egyptian women who can pick up a baby, because I'm sure, remember, the boys were being thrown into the Nile, so there must be a lot of, from time to time, I'm sure women will see floating dead male babies. Floating dead babies. But here's a princess who saw a basket, heard the cry, and maybe she saw the baby and she fell in love with this baby. Out of all the Egyptian women, happened to be the princess. And she gave his name Moses, which means drawn out, So it's probably not a Hebrew name, but God prepared all that. And so Moses, for 40 years, lived in the palace. So here's a Jewish boy, here's a Hebrew boy, never experienced slave enslavement. He grew up in the palace. He got the royal training, royal education. He learned about military. He learned about government. He learned about the law. He learned about architecture. He learned about everything about how to be a king. Isn't that amazing, church? God prepared him for 40 years. A Jew prepared to think like a king. But his training wasn't complete yet. Why? Because God knows that when he set the people free, for the next 40 years, he has to lead 2.5 million people in a desert. And he never been in a desert before. Because he lived as a palace, as a prince. So even though it was his mistake, because he remembered his roots, his Hebrew roots. And so he tried to, remember one day he tried to defend a Jew, and then he killed the Egyptian. And Pharaoh found out, and even though it was his mistake, he ran away to the desert to save his life. And he was another 40 years, he was trained as a shepherd. Why does he have to be trained as a shepherd, church? Because he needed that experience, because he's going to lead people in the desert. And he never been in the desert. Let me ask you a question here. How many of you here never went camping in your life before? How many of you? When I say camping, I'm not talking about in a campground, okay? Okay, campground, when you sleep in a tent, but you can take a shower in the normal bathroom, there is toilet, there is mirror, there's hot water. That's not camping, okay? That's just, I don't know what you call it, that's just a cheap motel, okay? But you know what I'm saying? How many of you never really went camping where you live in the outdoor for a couple days? No lights, no electricity, no bathroom, no toilet paper, no nothing, except just the wilderness and you. How many of you never done that before? Okay, a couple of you are really shy. Don't worry, it's nothing wrong with that, okay? But let's just say there's a few of you, okay? Now let's suppose, okay, I see Herman and Nani, let's say, okay? I saw Nani raise her hand, but anyway. Let's suppose that God wants to use Herman and Nani to lead LIC one day, okay, for 4 years to live in the wilderness, in the jungle, okay? God knows that LIC is going to take a mission trip to Hawaii one day, and the plane's going to crash in the middle of nowhere and land in a desert island, okay? And God wants to use Herman and Nani to lead LIC to survive for 4 years in the jungle with no electricity, no nothing. Do you think they'll make a good leader? They've never been outside the city, okay? Of course not. They're gonna, that's like blind leading the blind, right? We all gonna die, okay? So that's not gonna work. So if Moses never lived in a desert before, how can he lead the people into the desert? So he had to go experience the desert life for 40 years, where he learned the weather pattern of the desert, where he learned where the watering holes, where he learned what animals to avoid because of the danger, what plants that are poisonous or good to eat. He needed that experience. He needed that skills. So finally, after 80 years, he got his true calling. He had the training. He thinks like a king, but he also knows how to survive in the desert. Now he's ready. And he finally got his real calling after 80 years. Church, I want to encourage all of you here. Take a moment right now. God never make a mistake. We make mistake, but if we love God, He can still use it. He will train. He will use all those experience that we have to equip us, to prepare us to do great things for Him. Maybe you experience failure in your business, maybe failure in your marriage, or maybe failure in your relationship, maybe failure in whatever it is. It's most likely, it is our fault probably in those things. Like Moses did. He killed an Egyptian. It's his fault. But God still used that so that he got driven to the desert for 40 years, but that is actually a training for him for his real calling that's going to come up. And so whatever experience you went through, church, in the past or you're going through right now, don't give up. Because God wants to use that to prepare us to be a great leader, and because God wants to use us or something. My experience in Canada, when I think about it, why did I go to school as a biochemist? Why did I go through to get my commercial license in flying? Why I went to the military? I don't believe that all that's a waste. God has used that all those times, even though it was difficult sometimes, even though I hated biochemistry at sometimes, all these things, but God used that to prepare me as I fulfill His calling in my life. Let me show you a short video clip, what it says, that I think some of you have seen it last year, but it points out what I'm trying to say here about Proverbs 30, that we need someone that thinks like a king in order to lead Israel.
Because a man is born in slavery, that doesn't mean that he is a slave. He has to think of himself as a slave before he is one.